Welcome to Body Signals, a Signos podcast. I'm your host, Bill Tanser, Chief Data Scientist here at Signos. This is Season 4, Episode 7, CGM Insights from Primary Care Physician Dr. Resham Uttamchandani. On this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Uttamchandani, or Dr. U, for a discussion about her insights, both treating pre-diabetic and type 2 diabetic patients as a primary care physician. On this episode, we discuss advice that Dr. Yu gives her patients about managing their glucose, the high incidence of diabetes in Southeast Asian populations, glucose and skin conditions and aging, and Dr. Yu's own experience wearing Signos and her top aha moments. This and so much more. A brief disclaimer. Dr. Uttamchandani's appearance on this show and her statements are meant for educational purposes only. No doctor-patient relationship is established by her appearance on Body Signals. Should you have any questions on today's topics, you should consult with your own healthcare provider. Now on to today's show. And we're live, and we are so thrilled to have Dr. Uttamchandani with us. She is a family physician, as I mentioned in the intro, and we're going to talk about some really interesting things. We're going to talk about how, as a clinician, she treats people that are type 2 diabetics and maybe pre-diabetic. We're going to talk about something that we touched on briefly in another episode with Dr. Sunil Kolawat, and that is the incidence of diabetes in South Asian populations. We're going to talk about some skin issues, which we've never talked about on this episode. And probably one of my favorite things to talk to a clinician about is Dr. Yu is actually wearing Signos, and I'd love to discuss some of the insights that she's gotten on herself from looking at her glucose data. So, Doc, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's so great to have you, and I'm really, really excited to have a frontline family practitioner on the show. Because I had a personal experience. I think may have relayed this on a previous episode, but I think this is a great jumping off point. I went to my doctor for a checkup, and he took some blood. He took my fasting glucose, and he came back. He said, "Your fasting glucose is 99. You're right on the edge of being pre-diabetic. You got to do something about that." Essentially, is what he told me. And I said, "What, doc? What do I do?" And he says, "Well, maybe just lose some weight." And I said, "How?" And he said, "I don't know. I'm a doctor. Lose some weight." I would start there. Exercise. I'm already exercising, doctor. So I wonder if you face this as a clinician. Do you have patients coming to you that you feel like might be on the edge or they're pre-diabetic? And what type of advice do you give your patients?
Yes, I see it all the time. I would say at least 70 or 80% of my patients are usually in the pre-diabetic range, or at least meet criteria for metabolic syndrome.
70 to 80%?
Yes.
Wow.
And even if I'm not testing it, they already show signs and symptoms that they have already some of the risk factors and some of the criteria, not all, to reach metabolic syndrome. So I think that is quite outstanding of a number. And in medical school, we were taught to, use the line diet and exercise. I used to write that in my note. I can't even tell you how many times in residency. And it was just a line I used, but I never actually explained to them how to do it. And the more I dove into it, the more, I had my own health experiences, and I just wanted to understand, I can't let them go home with just this line. I need to give them more than that. I need to teach them how to read labels. I need to teach them how to exercise, when to exercise. In addition to that, just teaching them how to incorporate their cultural, differences, and, maybe not eating tortillas all the time, or finding ways to make healthier tortillas. Because I had a very large Hispanic population where I did my residency, and it became so much more meaningful, fulfilling. And I remember patients that would come back and I would reverse their diabetes with just nutrition. And I was only in residency. They would come and give me a hug. And it's just, at that point, you're like, okay, I'm doing something right. I'm on this path to, this discovery of nutrition. And I just wanted to dive in deeper and deeper. But then I moved to Northern California and joined Kaiser, which again, because the model is only allows for us to have 20 minutes with the patient. By the time, my MA rooms the patient, it's 7 minutes in, I only have maybe another 7 minutes to talk to them. And then I have to write my note. I'm not really getting anywhere with them. And so that was extremely frustrating, which is why I also got burnt out. But going back to your question of, what do I tell my patients? There's so much that goes to it. And I think more importantly, it's hearing their story and hearing about their day-to-day to find out where I can insert my pointers and my tips and my hacks, because, are they night shift workers? Are they, are they fasting a lot because that's what their friends are doing right now? Do they do HIIT workouts? There's so many components and it's so multifactorial that it's hard to just give them specific tips. But I usually start off with protein, fat, and vegetable with every meal. And I recommend eating less carbs for dinner. So that's where those are my first 2 pointers, and I slowly introduce other concepts.
Okay, so great tips. So protein, fat, and carbs with dinner, meaning no naked carbs. So you're combining all those foods.
Carbs for dinner. And again, everything has carbs. So it's kind of hard to also introduce them to that concept because they're reading labels, and especially the South Asians, everything has carbs in their diet. So it's a very hard concept for them to understand, but to just break it down, protein, fat, and vegetable with every meal, that keeps you satiated, and you won't even end up snacking in between meals. Okay,
so I got the nuance there. When you say vegetable, you're actually saying the non-starchy carbs, or the vegetables is what you should be aiming for dinner, which is great advice, because we've found that there seems to be a time component to glycemic response, and that you're pointing this out for dinner. That is the time when for a lot of our members, when we look across all the data, they are spiking as that evening meal.
Yes. And then, of course, walking after every meal, whether it's putting the dishes away or doing your laundry, something, going out for a walk with your spouse or partner, whichever it is, just, small things like that. But yes, again, that's one
of the tips at Signos we recommend a lot within our activities, is just getting some movement after meals. And this is one of the really cool things about wearing a CGM, is you can see how just a walk after eating something that has a moderate amount of carbs can really reduce your glycemic response to that meal. It's pretty amazing.
It's shocking, especially with the app that you guys have designed. Quite shocking. And it catches it right at the right time. And I'm like, all right, I'm going for my walk. I'm so sorry. I have to cut this conversation short.
Yeah. So I wonder, with your patient population, with just those suggestions, how many people are able to get their glucose below pre-diabetic levels with just those basic suggestions?
So that's a great question. So I would say a decent amount of them, if I have the time to explain the actual details and, the nuances to the changes in their diet. But I would say, so I usually, even if they're categorized under pre-diabetic or diabetic, I always give them a 3-month trial before I even consider metformin or any medication. I would say at least 20 to 30% change, but a lot of people also have genetics working against them, lifestyle, cultural factors. So it's really hard to evoke these changes, sustainable changes, I would say. And that's where I'm struggling and learning more about how, continuous glucose monitoring, or having patients understand their body more, their specific body, not the general consensus of information that we're giving out to people. Introducing them to those concepts, I think it's making more of a difference.
And I think you said something so important there, which is sustainable changes. I wonder how many of your patients go off the deep end, go complete keto, try and eliminate every carb from their diet. But then some might find it's so unsustainable that they just give up that effort. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, very much so. I cannot tell you the number of patients of mine that have lost 100, 120 pounds, keto, bariatric surgery, whatever it is. And then they gain it back because they don't have a lifestyle in place to implement these changes on a long-term situation. And, whether it's, I lost weight, I can eat this again, or, oh my God, my friends are going out, I'm going to have a couple drinks, or whatever it is. I think implementing these hacks are way easier. on a day-to-day than to starve yourself, fast for 24 hours, whatever, things that they're doing, whether it's paleo, keto. There are a couple new ones out there, these reset programs that people are all doing, which have barely any food. And so they're doing that, but then 30-pound weight loss, and then it's a 60-pound weight gain. So it's almost like double.
Yeah, because as we've seen in, I think it was the Biggest Losers study that we've talked about before on this show, that you can actually slow your metabolism down by doing these crash diets, which then when you go back to eating the way you were, you've now got the issue that your metabolism has been ground to a halt because of the few calories that you've been giving your body. It's just so fascinating to me. I wonder, in your clinical experience, does conversations about stress and sleep come into play for these same patients?
Yes. After I got trained in obesity medicine, I also promote, getting at least 7 hours of sleep, as well as stress reduction. Because even in my own experience, after wearing Signos, I realized how stress can play a role. That was also another aha moment for me. And I was just shocked because there's so many times in the day I felt the same way. And because I was not wearing Signos, I'm wondering how many glucose spikes I probably had in my lifetime just from not eating, but just overwhelmed or anxious.
Right. It's really quite fascinating, all these interdependencies that, yes, for a lot of people, you can get there with just your two diet hacks or nutrition hacks, I should say, because they're not diets. But then there's all these other things that can come into play that can really help people out. I can see where it'd be a challenge, 7-8 minutes. How could you possibly get to any of these topics?
Exactly. Sleep specifically with, the ghrelin hormone being increased, causing you to be hungrier. So I've noticed it even on my night shift. Now, when I go back to the times in residency, post night shift, I would just want a carb heavy burger. I remember those days where I remember heating up frozen dumplings before going to bed and getting ready for the next morning. It was terrible. So it's such a terrible diet.
Yeah, I know our listeners can probably identify with that. It's not just the ghrelin; it's also that if you don't get good sleep, you can suppress your leptin, which is your satiety hormone. So that it's like the 1-2 punch. You're hungry, and this ghrelin that's now circulating in your system is actually causing you to crave some more food and carbs, which are the things that are going to spike you.
Exactly.
Oh boy. Wow. So I want to switch topics quick to something that we had talked about when we were getting ready for this podcast. And that is that one of your interests is in the incidence of diabetes in South Asian populations. Like I said, we touched on this briefly. The first time I heard about this, right away my mind went to, in South Asian populations, there's a lot of white race. So maybe that's responsible. But then I saw some studies that show that there is no correlation between BMI and the incidence of diabetes in this population, which then I guess kind of makes you think, is there a genetic component that's responsible for what we're seeing here? So I'd love to know what you know about the incidence of diabetes in South Asian populations.
Yes, we as South Asians have a lot going against us. Not only do we have genetics, we also have a lot of visceral or truncal fat. And then again, our lifestyle and cultural factors. Our diet composed of, roti, which is wheat, rice, lentils. It's very, very carb focused. And, we lead a very sedentary lifestyle. That's just a fact. And, in addition to that, we have now the World Health Organization actually lowered the cutoffs for BMIs for South Asians. For, for a normal average American, it is 25, above 25 is overweight, above 30 is obese. And now for South Asians, we are using the 23 and 25 cutoff for the overweight and obese. It's 25 and 27.5 for the overweight and obese cutoff. So just the fact that we are now acknowledging that the cutoffs are different for South Asians versus Americans, I think we're heading in the right direction for sure. There's actually a masala trial which is being done in San Francisco to focus on all these risk factors specifically for South Asians. It's a longitudinal study. It's the largest longitudinal study to date.
Yeah. So just to clarify, when we say South Asians, we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, any other countries?
Yes, I think those are pretty much all of them that they fall under. Correct.
So not necessarily Southeast Asian, more the South Asian is where we're finding this. And from the research that you've studied, do we know how much of it is genetic and then the other factors like lifestyle and diet, or is it still too nascent for us to know?
I think it's still too early, but at least we're seeing these trends where, my father passed away at 57 from a heart attack. And now knowing everything that I do know, I'm like, well, he definitely had metabolics. I can almost list all of his health conditions and everything that was working against him. And of course, those are things that he was doing. He did follow the poor diet, but then he also had genetics working, against him. So just that combined, we are just overall, at a worse situation than the average individual.
Yeah. And when you say metabolic syndrome, it's the combination of having that abdominal fat, the high blood pressure, the high blood cholesterol, the high glucose. I'm missing one, I think.
LDL, triglycerides, waist circumference.
That's the one I missed, yeah. Triglycerides. So now with your patients, when you have patients from South Asia, do you follow a different protocol, or do you spend more time making sure that their glucose is stable?
Well, I follow the same protocol, which is checking their A1C every 3 months. But in addition to that, I cook a lot of Indian food at home, and so I've developed recipes or followed certain bloggers that have made recipes that actually taste good. I think the issue that we all have is that we want to eat our naan, but we're not willing to settle for some plastic non-equivalent.
Right.
And so I have tested out a lot of recipes, and I think I figured out a few good ones. So I usually share those with them, and a lot of just random snacks that they can get on Amazon or from Whole Foods. There's been a huge wave, and there's so many new products out there that actually taste good. So I'm also working on a product called the Healthy Snickers bar with dates, peanut butter. It's covered in dark chocolate with some sea salt. So I tell them about that recipe. It's a great way to get that last fix in after you eat your vegetables and your vegetables, protein, and then incorporating a sweet after that.
Yes, and if I can add a hack to your hacks, one that I was guilty of not hacking correctly was I'd wait an hour sometimes after having dinner to have that dessert, that little sweet treat. And I found a huge difference when I ate my dessert immediately following dinner, because I was having the proteins and the fats and the vegetables in combination with the carb. With the dessert an hour later, I was essentially having a naked carb and a huge spike, of course, right before sleep, which is the last time when you want a spike.
Yeah,
like
so you get that double spike of anything. Yeah, completely agree. Yes, I usually go for my dessert right after my meal, and then I stop.
And walk. Take a walk.
And walk.
And walk.
Yes, my husband thinks I'm crazy. I'll walk around the living room while watching TV. And I was recently in St. Martin, which is where I went off the deep end, because whenever I go back there, it's all nostalgic food full of carbs. And one of our famous dishes there is called a Johnny cake, and it's essentially fried bread and dough. And I would eat it plain, and the spike was unreal. And I told myself I'm just not going to look at it until later, because I was wearing the Signos at the time. And, it was wild to see how high it flew with just a naked carb. But, after that, I was like, hey, Mom, can we walk around the table at this restaurant? Because it feels normalize this. Like, why are we normalizing just walking around the table after dinner? Like, why? Because then you just sit there and you talk and then you pay the bill. And it's like such a lengthy process. And in my mind, I'm like thinking about all these like mechanisms that are happening in my body. I'm like, I just need to go walk.
Yeah, that is a challenge, especially with a big dinner out, is extricating yourself. Good for you for walking around the table. I don't know how my wife would feel about me just getting up and walking around the table in a restaurant, but good for you for getting that movement. Yeah, I've been experimenting. There was a study that came out, I forgot where it came out from, about just doing calf raises to moderate glycemic response. And so my latest hack that I've been trying, and I encourage our listeners to try, is that if you are in that social situation, it's kind of hard for you to get up and walk around the table in the restaurant. Just doing calf raises seated during and after your meal might be enough. Just that little bit of movement might be enough.
I saw that study too. It's quite interesting, with the hacks that we're developing. And I can't imagine what our, how we're going to be treating patients in 10 years from now.
Yeah. And in interest of full disclosure, I think it was something like 40 minutes of calf raises. So it's not like you just do like 10 and be done. So you're pretty much doing it the entire meal, but something to try.
Kettlebell, something, right? To just burn off that sugar right away.
Absolutely. So we, in prepping for this episode, I realized that you had an interest also in treating skin conditions, and you believe there's some connection between glucose and things like acne.
100%. I cured my acne with just nutrition. I had pimples literally everywhere. And when I think about it, of course, there's dairy, which I was drinking a full glass of milk and eating a cheese toast on my way to school every morning. So very high glycemic foods. And just cutting that down when I discovered that was a potential cause, my skin cleared up in about 3 months. It was crazy to see just by introducing more, fiber and nutrient dense products. In addition to that, I do think that, just high sugar content or glucose spikes can also lead to insulin resistance, PCOS, and acne from other forms. So the insulin resistance can lead to more testosterone, which can then lead to more acne, and it can also increase sebum production, causing clogged pores, inflammation, and then acne that way.
Yeah, and when you mentioned that, I was doing some of my own research, and I came upon this topic of glycation. And the fact that that could actually cause some skin aging, which I had no idea about. Can you tell us a little bit about glycation?
Sure. It's when the sugar molecules binds to proteins such as elastin and collagen, and that causes them to disrupt their normal cellular processes, and it leads to a molecule called advanced glycation end product, also known as AGEs. And these products basically disrupt and cause, wrinkles, fine lines, decreased elastin, skin sagging, also known as like the sugar sag that people have been referring to online. It's crazy to think about, all the products and all the things that we're all doing to try and prevent aging, but no one's just looking at what they're eating. Nobody. I mean, we're slowly starting to trend in the right direction, but I can even speak for, people I hang around with, whether it's family, friends. It's just we just want to indulge. We just think, the 80-20 rule, I still believe in that, but I think there's more to it. And when I did follow a really strict diet, I remember for my wedding, I remember my skin was glowing. Like I saw a physical difference in the texture of my skin.
And a lot of that may have been the sugar part of your diet, possibly.
Yes.
Yes. And so some great advice there. If you've got acne, try paying attention to your glucose, especially Signos members. If that's been an issue, see if lowering your spikes and keeping your average glucose lower helps you with reducing acne. And as a benefit, you might actually get better skin as you limit the amount of glycation that's going on in your skin from all that added sugar.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to get to my favorite topic with practitioners. You've been wearing Signos for a while.
Yes.
I wonder.
Yes, I'm
curious what your first aha moment was from Signos?
My first one was when I had my oat milk latte. I was just shocked. And I've been having that pretty much every morning for as long as I can remember. And I was stunned, and I was like, told my husband, we're never buying oat milk again. We're switching to almond milk right away. And we were in Dubai at the time. And I was just mind blown.
Is this what? Is this a latte that you got at a like a coffee shop?
At the restaurant. It was at the hotel we were staying at, one of the breakfasts, and it was the first thing I had in the morning. And there was no sugar, no maple syrup, nothing else was in there. It was just, a shot of espresso and some oat milk, just a splash. It was enough to cause a very sharp peak and decline. And after that, I was like, I'd rather just drink black coffee than have oat milk.
I'm a coffee connoisseur, so I applaud the black coffee. But I've actually played around with this oat latte spike, and I found personally that it's very dependent on the oat milk that you're using. That there are some brands that include a lot of added sugar within their oat milk. If you can eliminate those, you might still get a spike from the oat milk itself. And this, I found it varies by individual. We've got some members that don't spike at all from oat milk and some that do. But and this is hard when you're at a hotel or a restaurant or at a cafe, but when you're making your own drinks, if you can just look at the carton and see what's the added sugar in this particular oat milk, that's a great first step to at least reducing the spike somewhat. I'll add, another one that's kind of interesting. One of my first aha moments was I thought that eating whole wheat was the way to go. And I would just grab the whole wheat off the shelf. And it was actually one of my, one of our co-founders, actually the founder of the company, Resham, who loves to bake. He told me, hey, Bill, when they bake wheat bread, they add sugar to help the bread rise. So everyone thinks that wheat bread is the healthier option. If you're going to eat wheat, again, look at the label on the back and see what the added sugars are. And sure enough, the one that I had grabbed had like 8-10 grams of added sugar per slice. Wow. It was just part of the baking process. They weren't trying to make it sweeter. It just was required. So yeah, those little things, those little hidden things can cause spikes like you found in your oat milk. Yes.
Another one was sushi. I was pleasantly surprised with no spike with sushi, like barely anything. If anything, it was a little hump. And whether it was the vinegar in the sushi rice or, resistant starch, I don't know if it was rice from the day before, whatever it was, I was like, I'm in for sushi. I'm down for sushi every day of the week if that's the case.
Not everyone has had that experience. But I've heard this from several people. I actually have not had the advantage of the non-sushi spike. But I think for those that do well on sushi, I think you're right. I think it's those two things. It's the added vinegar to the rice. And we've talked about on this podcast our apple cider vinegar experiment. This is kind of an extension of that. So having a little bit of apple cider vinegar, a tablespoon or two before having a carb can reduce your spike. Well, in sushi rice, a lot of sushi rice does contain vinegar as just part of being sushi rice, and that can reduce your glycemic impact. But the other fascinating one is resistant starch. So if you cook rice and then cool it, oftentimes it starts building resistant starch, which lowers your spike. So it could be, for you, it apparently really works. So that's the great thing of finding the foods that work for you. So instead of telling your patients, you just have to cut out all carbs, go full on keto, not sustainable. When you have a CGM, you can start testing these things. So if you haven't tested sushi yet, do it. Do it too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another one was when I was in a heated discussion with my husband and my sugar started rising, and then Signos warned me, telling me to go exercise. And I literally was like, we need to stop talking right now. Like, I can't have this conversation. I need to go for a walk. It's affecting my cortisol levels. Like, I'm seeing it in action. And then that was also a huge aha moment, not just for me, but just for all my patients that are, in stressful situations, jobs, family, whatever their situation is just really finding ways to decompress and to relax. And it's definitely hard, even for myself. But, whether it's exercise, yoga, meditation, reading a book, a funny show, anything to get your stress level down.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's such a great suggestion. And I've seen that as well. In fact, just before we started, we had a technical difficulty, and I was looking at I've got my complication on my Apple Watch that's the Signos data, and sure enough, my glucose is going up like 130, 140. I was like, how do I fix this? I can't talk to her. I don't know how to fix this. And luckily, we got it all working. But it's just another example of how something as little as stress and, understanding when you're feeling stressed and then doing things. It could be as simple as like breathing exercise. I've had members tell me that just on the Apple Watch, there's that free part of the Apple Watch, the Breathe app.
Yes.
Just doing, a 5-minute breathe session with the Apple Watch, or there's so many different free and paid apps out there for meditation. You mentioned yoga, and maybe it's just the distraction, like you said, of watching a comedy, laughing a little bit. The combination of walking, just getting out in nature, I think is a wonderful way to reduce stress levels and get some movement at the same time. Same for yoga. That those things, it's not just what you're eating. It's a little bit more than that, which to me is exciting because it's more levers that we can pull. And some of them very easy levers and pleasurable ones to reduce stress and get back to a healthy glucose level.
Yes, absolutely. I can imagine, just whether it was in residency or any stressful moments in my job, how many times my glucose actually spiked in a day. I wish everyone can find out, what it is that's causing stress in their life and pinpointing it to realize, because when you see those numbers on the monitor, that itself is an eye opener, and that's enough for me to want to make changes in my life. Absolutely.
Yeah, very well said. So these are some great glucose aha moments. I think you've covered all of like the top areas. So I hope that our listeners look into some of these as well for themselves and see if they check in with their Signos when they're having a stressful moment, or just they can't explain a high glucose number. Perhaps it's stress. Maybe it's not something you're eating. You get that movement. And I think really important as we're talking about these experiments and the fact that you found that sushi rice is like your go-to now. It's the idea of playing with your food when you have you have that access to Signos to see what spikes you and what doesn't. If you don't experiment, you may not find some of the things that really work well for you. So.
Yes, and I know I played around with oatmeal. Oatmeal did not work for me, no matter what I did to it. It definitely just spiked me. But I know that you've done quite a few experiments with oatmeal.
So I keep saying I am going to get through one episode of Body Signals without talking about oatmeal. But this is episode 37, and I am going to talk about oatmeal. But yes, that was my aha moment. Is that doctor visit that I told you about, where my doctor said you're borderline pre-diabetic, you got to lose weight. So I did some research, and this is a couple of years ago. One of the top suggestions I found was, well, have a heart-healthy breakfast, because I was also interested in lowering my cholesterol, and it recommended oatmeal. So I'd been eating an oatmeal for a while before I actually started with Signos, and I think my first morning with a sensor on, I went up to 180 on that bowl of oatmeal, which I gave it up for a while, but then I came back to it. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to engineer this oatmeal so it works for me. So just like you were saying, by adding things to your meal like fats and proteins, I added almond butter. I added chia seeds. I didn't put greens in because it was not a savory oatmeal. But I found that just by adjusting the things in the oatmeal itself, and even portion size was another huge lever. So you could just reduce the portion size by a bit and have a huge effect. I now can eat oatmeal with no glycemic effect at all, which
none, no. I'd love to know the exact recipe. I'll try that.
Yeah, and it's going to be different for everyone, but I'll tell you exactly what it is. So it's a tablespoon of almond butter. I used Barney's, the non-sugar version.
Love that one.
That's a great one. I put 2 tablespoons of chia seeds, a tablespoon of flaxseed meal. I put some whole walnuts on top. I eliminated the banana, but if I really feel like a banana, I'll have a slightly green banana in that oatmeal. And the greener the banana, the less the glycemic impact for most people. But that's essentially it. And some blueberries. Blueberries don't spike me at all, so I can put a whole handful of blueberries in there to give it some sweetness without having the spike. So there you go.
That's great.
And yet we're going to rename this show Body Oatmeal or Oatmeal Signals. Yes, I love talking about oatmeal. Well, Doc, it's such a pleasure having you on Body Signals.